Hofstra University Presidential Symposium Solutions for a Sustainable Tomorrow. And I want to welcome you to the second day afternoon session here. The theme is Sustainable Solution, or Solutions for a Sustainable Tomorrow. Sustainable solutions are found at the intersection of science, economics, and social equity, and education, of course, is also very important. There's little doubt that climate change is our largest and most daunting sustainability challenge. And with that in mind, today's sessions have focused on the topic of climate change. Back in the 1960s, a media commentator named Marshall McLuhan very presciently said, quote, "There are no passengers on spaceship Earth. Everybody is a member of the crew. We have moved into an age in which everybody's activities affect everybody else." And that is very true, nowhere more so than in our reliance on fossil fuel energy and the disastrous side effects of climate change that have come from the changes we are making to the Earth's atmosphere. So we've approached the theme of climate change today we're approaching the theme of climate change today from three angles. In the morning, we had a session on project-based learning as a way to teach about climate change so that we can empower people to understand both the causes and effects of climate change. We just had a keynote speaker over the last hour and a half, Dr. Amy Marszalek of Stony Brook University, who talked about the technology, the battery technology that's being developed to help us move our electrical grid from one based on fossil fuels to one based on renewable energy sources. And now we are going to talk about what is arguably the greatest climate disaster to impact the New York region, which was Superstorm Sandy, which happened 10 years ago. And we have a distinguished panel of folks who have worried about Superstorm Sandy and its impacts to lead us through that discussion. Before I introduce Dr. Jase Bernhardt, my colleague in the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability, I just want to remind everybody that in Pride Park, behind the Student Center, from 6 to 8 tonight, we have a Taste of the Neighborhood Community Barbecue is one of our events. So free food, everyone, 6 to 8. You don't want to miss out on that. First rule of life is never pass up a free meal. So with that, let me bring Dr. Jase Bernhardt to the podium here, and he'll take over. Jase.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending session 5 of the symposium. This is Superstorm Sandy, 10 years later. So as mentioned, my name is Jase Bernhardt. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability here at Hofstra. And this panel is actually the brainchild of my colleague in geology, Dr. Krista Farmer, is also here today, of course, and I'd like to acknowledge her for also organizing all the panelists that we have here today. In the fall of 2012, Superstorm Sandy made landfall on the New Jersey coast and brought unprecedented coastal flooding to New York City, New Jersey, Long Island, and beyond. 10 years later, believe it or not, it's almost 10 years ago now, it's certainly time to look back and take stock of the lessons we have learned and the actions we have taken, and probably more importantly, the actions we have not taken to make our coastal communities more resilient and adaptable to future storms that could be similar or even worse than Sandy. To facilitate these reflections, today's event consists of 3 distinguished speakers, all of whom bring unique expertise to this panel. So first of all, in the middle, we have Marianne Trashiati. Marianne is Professor of Rhetoric and Director of Labor Studies here at Hofstra, and a Long Beach resident and activist. After Superstorm Sandy, she started a project to collect stories from members of the community about their experiences with the storm and its immediate aftermath. That project was actually the basis for a collaboration with Dr. Krista Farmer and Dr. Elizabeth Plorin, also here at Hofstra, on a community-based study of messaging and decision-making about evacuation before hazardous weather, which was funded by NOAA and Sea Grant in 2014. And next, we have Adam Sobel on the far end of the panel. And Adam Sobel is a professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and its engineering school. He studies the dynamics of climate and weather, particularly in the tropics. In recent years, he's become particularly focused on understanding the risks to society from extreme weather events and climate change. He's received numerous awards in recent years from organizations such as the American Meteorological Society, the AXA Research Fund, and the American Geophysical Union. He is author or co-author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles, a book, Storm Surge, which is on sale outside of the auditorium for later on. You can even get it autographed, I bet. That's about Hurricane Sandy and climate change. And he's written many op-eds and articles in mainstream media for sources including the New York Times, CNN, and the LA Times, and many others. He currently hosts a podcast, Deep Convection, which features wide-ranging conversation with other climate scientists. And finally, closest to me on the panel, we have Nelson Vaz. And Nelson is the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the New York National Weather Service Office. Nelson serves as a principal interface between the Weather Service Office and users of its products and services, leading efforts to ensure their evaluation and improvement. He's also responsible for planning, coordinating, and carrying out public awareness programs in the local tri-state area designed to build a weather-ready nation. Nelson has worked as a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in New York for 19 years and serves as a subject matter expert on coastal and shoreline hazards and weather decision support services for the local area, and has been in this role of warning coordination meteorologist since 2018. So to get this conversation started, each panelist will speak for a little while about their perspectives on Sandy. Then we will transition into a robust discussion among the panelists, and finally have plenty of time for questions from the audience. And note, when it comes time for questions, please use the microphone in the audience. There's 2 microphones in the middle aisle and on the far aisle over there. So for our panelists, first we'll have Nelson briefly discussing the meteorology and forecasting of Sandy. Next we'll have Marianne presenting a community level perspective based on her expertise and her experience during the storm in Long Beach. And finally, we'll have Adam looking at the storm through the lens of a changing climate and policy discussions. Okay, Nelson, why don't you go ahead?
All right, thank you, Jase. I appreciate the intro, and I just want to thank, Jase has been a great partner of the National Weather Service here for, probably going close to a decade, but several years now. One of the things with Sandy that, really came to light was the need for improved communication messaging of storm surge. And, Jase has done some great work using visual reality to help in that manner. How does tropical storm surge, what does that look like? And how would you experience it in kind of, a virtual reality setting, kind of being the closest you can come to without actually being in danger in it. So Jase has done some great work with that, and also rip currents. So, in terms of fatalities, you think about our area, Sandy and storm surge, unfortunately, is the number one in terms of fatalities. If you look back the last 15 years, we had 44 fatalities from storm surge, another 23, I believe, fatalities from wind, just from Sandy alone. But if you look at what are the other top fatality-causing weather hazards, rip currents are actually on an annual basis outside of heat. Rip currents are number one. Unfortunately, we lose several people each year to rip currents. So the work Jase is doing is tremendous on both sides, on the tropical and the rip current side, to get that awareness. So thank you, Jase. And now, kind of to turn it back to Sandy, I think, thank you again for inviting me to this panel and to be on with distinguished panelists. I have firsthand kind of experience in terms of the operational forecasting. I was a meteorologist. I had just become basically a lead meteorologist. I was kind of a year in the position when Sandy affected us. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit on that, and then we can maybe go back to the kind of the meteorology aspect. But as Jay said, this was basically Superstorm Sandy, a Category 1 post-tropical storm, and there's all kinds of definitions, but basically made landfall into southern New Jersey and brought devastating storm surge. As much as areas seeing inundation anywhere as much as 6 to 8 feet, some areas close to 9 feet, especially in the New York Harbor area, New Jersey Harbor. And so, of course, a devastating event, and the big thing is the number of fatalities. So this is a time with these anniversaries to kind of reflect, remember those who were, the lives were lost, kind of reflect back on what have we learned, kind of go back to those experiences, the experiences of others, to kind of get a frame of reference, with future events. Today is the anniversary of the 1938 hurricane. So just very topical in terms of having this discussion. Really, 1938 hurricane. We think of how bad Sandy was. 1938 hurricane really could. The impacts that we're seeing with that mostly affected eastern Long Island, but we were talking about double the storm surge. Winds that were almost double the winds that we saw with Sandy. So Sandy was horrible, destructive, but it's not a worst case scenario for us. And I think that's the thing. These events like this really help us to kind of keep things in perspective and make sure we're preparing every year for the hurricane season. And just to kind of reflect back, real quick on just operationally, being an operational meteorologist means we're the ones putting out the forecast. National Weather Service, we're putting out watches, warnings, advisories, the forecasts, 7 days a week. We're working rotating shifts, 24/7, always watching weather. So, and any type of, observation, forecasts and watches and warnings are really our key. But in addition to that, we also provide weather support for our emergency managers, to the media, public safety officials. That's really one of the key ways that we can get the messaging out. So, just going back to Sandy, I kind of remember, 6-7 days in advance, we're seeing this in the weather models. You have the hurricane developing down in the central Caribbean, becoming a major hurricane as it goes over Cuba. And then the models, all of a sudden, and maybe some of you have heard this, the European model, first one to show that there could be significant impacts or direct impacts to our area in terms of where Sandy would kind of eventually go. And then other models started to come into line. And so, out 5, 6, 7 days, we already had, this was something unique. This was an event that we haven't seen and could be quite, this could be really, I don't want to say unprecedented, but I want to say a major event, a destructive event, life-threatening event. And so we started providing, messaging out that far. The forecasts, kind of hinting at it, but especially as we're going to 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, increasing the wording in our warnings, our watches, our statements, putting out preparedness information. The big thing also, we were very active with our emergency management partners. As we're seeing the threat for almost hurricane force winds, storm surge that was going to rival in terms of the height of that astronomical tide, plus that storm surge, that water's being pushed in on top of that tide. So what we call the storm tide, the levels that we were seeing based on the weather modeling we had and the storm surge is major to record levels. So all this stuff, these type of information, we're amping up the urgency, amping up the messaging, and working with our emergency management partners. We were actually embedded with our emergency management partners. Besides doing multiple daily briefings, all the way from regional to local level, we were actually also embedded in New York City Emergency Management, Nassau, Suffolk County, regional. And we felt in terms of we felt good in terms of the rhythm we were providing forecasts, the information we were providing, but we felt like something was missing. You know, we had great information on the hazards. We felt confident in terms of what we were putting out in terms of peak winds, total amount of water, but that's always a frustration as a forecaster. Maybe is there something else missing? We see this being destructive, possibly life-threatening, but the tools we had at the time, how can we provide information on what the impacts are going to be? How can we provide something that's going to give better information to the emergency managers to make evacuation decisions for the public so they can visualize this is really dangerous? And at that time, that's what we were missing. So when I walked in, I was working midnight shifts. I walked in, actually I drove in, dodging some falling trees actually, that night of Sandy as it was making its, the 29th that evening. And walking into the office and seeing the pictures coming out of, from the media, all the flooding in New York City, and knowing, the impacts you saw down in Staten Island, other areas of New York City, New Jersey, you knew lives were being lost. And so for us as meteorologists, operational, where, our mission is protection of life and property through our watches and warnings, you see that, and you just think, you're heartbroken because, what could I have done better? What could we have done better? And how do you go, and so it can motivate you, or you could just be like, we tried our best, and what are we going to do? But I think what I'm proud about, encouraged about, and even these type of events here is where we've come 10 years from Sandy. The collaborations between academia, governmental, our emergency management partners, kind of reviewing the post-review, analyzing what are the gaps in the science, what are the gaps in the communication, the remote sensing, the messaging, all that. That's it's extensively been done since Sandy, and what I'm proud of and confident in is. It's by the work of we're just a little part of it as a National Weather Service. It's by by my colleagues up here as well in terms of the science, the social science, the physical science, improving the forecast. We're in a much better place now. If we have a Sandy, we have a 1938 hurricane, we have something that's unique. We not only the forecasts were actually pretty good back then, but we didn't have the visualization tools, the communication tools, the alerting systems. We have we have that in place now, and that's what I'm I guess the message I want to get is that sometimes it takes these type of events to really kind of find where your weakness is, where the gaps are. But the important thing is kind of coming together collaboratively to address those. And I think we've done a lot, and we can talk more about it during this discussion. But I think for you guys to take away is that these type of events are going to happen in a warming planet, increasing population, increasing coastal infrastructure. We're going to have, unfortunately, destructive events, life-threatening events. But we have the ability to maybe be more weather ready, mitigate these events ahead of time, because of the work that's been done and that will continue to be done, after these type of major events. So I'll stop there. Too much.
Thank you, Nelson.
Hi, everyone. I just want to give a special shout out to my students, current and past. I see a number of faces of people. Hi. So thank you for coming. And even though for some of you it was mandatory, thanks for coming anyway. So my name is Maryann Trasciatti. I'm a faculty member here, and in my academic, intellectual life, I am really fascinated by the intersection of public memory, public space, and activism. And with Superstorm Sandy, I usually study these things in the past, right? Particularly in the early 20th century. And with Superstorm Sandy, I actually got a chance to live my research interests in the present. And I can tell you that's not always a good thing. In 2012, I had been living in Long Beach for 13 years. And when the storm came, despite orders from the city and weather reports that suggested, this could be pretty intense, my family and I did not evacuate, nor did most people on my block, nor did most people in Long Beach. And those of you who live on an island, Long Island's an island, but it's so big, I think we forget sometimes that it's an island. Manhattan's an island, but it's really big, Staten Island. But if you live on an island that's conscious of being an island, there's kind of an island mentality. And you think, yeah, mere mortals evacuate in the face of storms. But island people, like, we're not mortals the way everybody else is. We're not, excuse my expression, candy ass. So we don't have to leave. That was a mistake. The storm was an extraordinarily stressful situation. The city of Long Beach during and afterward, was a mess. There were fires, there was flooding, there was, sewage that rolled through the streets. I remember calling or texting friends and saying, oh my gosh, there's water and all this crap in my living room, then texting back, that was a figure of speech, there's no crap, then texting again, actually that should be taken literally. There is sewage. So everything was a mess. And quite frankly, my life was a mess. It's a really, really stressful situation to be trapped in your house as the waters rise. I don't swim, and to realize that you can't save yourself, nor can you save anybody else around you. And it's not an exaggeration for me to say that I'm physically uncomfortable up here. I'm almost to the point of twitching, kind of thinking about all of this stuff in the kind of the first person. I punctuate my life in some ways before Sandy and after Sandy. And I see another resident of Long Beach here, who I will mention in a minute, nodding. Now it's like BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID, but there's also BS and AS for me. It was that stressful. But people pulled together. When something really threatening happens, there are three things that you can do, right? We tend to emphasize fight or flight. So you can fight, which you're not going to do in the face of rising waters. You can leave, which we didn't do. But the third that gets a lot less attention is tend and befriend. And there was a lot of tend and befriend after Sandy in the community, and I wanted to be part of the tending and befriending. But I didn't know what to do. I'm not really good. And the one thing that was really interesting was how quickly after Sandy traditional gender roles manifested, right? So you had a lot of guys doing the heavy lifting, literally, and then you had women doing the caretaking. And for better or worse, that's just what happened. And I don't know how to rebuild houses. I'm not a therapist, but I do have I have a training in rhetoric, and I thought, well, stories can be very therapeutic. They can help, narrative can help people understand things and make sense of things and feel like, they're dealing with the trauma of an experience. So I thought, let me collect stories. I wanted my contribution to the community to be helping people understand what happened to them, why they made the decisions they made, and then to create a memory archive, a community-based memory archive. So to do that, I had to find a space, and there weren't any. Almost every space in the city was either destroyed or completely uninhabitable, even for the duration of an interview. So I used a coffee shop in town. And we set up at a coffee shop. I got some volunteers to help me with the camera. Students from Hofstra were very helpful. The university was terrific. And we invited people to come and share their stories. And they did, and other people watched, and then they shared their stories. And then it kind of spread, and then other people contacted me, or I contacted them. And so ultimately, what I managed to do was to collect stories from a cross-section of the community. People of all sorts, elected officials, appointed government representatives, leaders of community organizations, owners of their places of living, renters, white, black, Latino, citizens, undocumented people, abled people, disabled people. I mean, it really was a cross-section of the community, giving me kind of a community-wide perspective on the storm. And in collecting those stories, I really learned a lot. I talked to some amazing people. One of them is here, my former city manager, Jack Schneerman. Raise your hand just so everybody knows who you are, who was fantastic. These interviews were transcribed by the wife of the librarian in town. And she was really struck by some of the profound recollections of people. But in particular, she was struck by Jack Schneerman's recounting of his experiences and said, I wish everybody could read this because the city did such a fantastic job and Jack worked so hard, and I don't think many people realize what it took to get a whole city, small though it is, through this storm. The project, which I called Long Beach Sandy, got really great press coverage. I mean, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Newsday, the Long Beach Herald, PBS. There was an award-winning segment on PBS. So a lot of people were really interested for the moment, right? We were in this like fishbowl, and everybody wanted to know how we were doing. And then kind of all that dissipated. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. And that became the basis, as Jase said in his introduction, of a collaboration on a NOAA Sea Grant funded study about some of the things that you were talking about, like what do you say to get people to evacuate, and what will people listen to, and who will they listen to, and et cetera. And it's hard to look back on this project. I've had offers from people in the community. Carla Schuster from University Relations and I met a few times about kind of revisiting this and really moving it forward. And I've resisted, just because it's really difficult to look back on these things. But I know that that's something that could be very fruitful, and I maybe need a little bit more time. But it is important. The stories of ordinary people and the way they make sense of these things are really important. So that was then. Looking at the now, I asked myself in preparation for these comments, what do I see when I look around Long Beach? And those of you who are from Long Beach or have been to Long Beach, you are welcome in your comments and questions afterward to tell me things I've missed or mischaracterized, or this is a very, very subjective vision. After the storm, I read a book. Some of you may have heard of Rebecca Solnit. If you've ever heard the expression mansplaining, she was really the first person to kind of introduce that idea. And Rebecca Solnit wrote a book, A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And I hated the book. I kind of hated everyone after Sandy who was what I thought like pontificating about, well, what the role of government should be, what the Red Cross should or should not be doing, what people do in these situations. And I thought, buzz off. Like, you're not here, you don't understand, and you're making money off of these kinds of things. And it really kind of bugged me. And I almost wrote her a letter, but I didn't. And I really hated it. But I actually saw then, well, she kind of has a point, right? After a disaster, some really extraordinary stuff can happen. Communities can really be profoundly knit together. And that happened in Long Beach. There was an extraordinary community that arose out of this disaster. And social media played a big part, but so did individuals chipping in and doing their best for one another. But what I've come to see in the 10 years since Sandy is that, like much of the U.S., the extraordinary community that arose out of Sandy is now very fragmented. It no longer exists in Long Beach. And social media plays a big part in that. The same social media that drew us together post-Sandy, that was a space for sharing information, things, people helping people, has now become a space for backbiting, for vilifying, for, untruths, so to speak. And so I lament that, and I don't know what that means going forward. I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out about other communities if they had the same experience. But I do know that in my personal experience, you knit together and then you fray apart again. Now, that's not to say that important and good stuff hasn't happened in Long Beach. We've embarked on important infrastructure projects. We've built a safer and, in some ways, more beautiful boardwalk. The Army Corps of Engineers project that was put off before in Long Beach to create dunes has, I think, really been a good thing, right? We have these dunes that protect us now from waves on the beach. We've expanded the bulkheads in the communities where there are canals. And environmental activism has a home in Long Beach. So we have organizations like All Our Energy, which is run by a local resident, George Poval, it does extraordinary work. We have a ban on single-use plastic bags and balloons and all these other things. And George is really an advocate for renewable energy. We've got Climate Jobs New York. Mariah Dignan lives in Long Beach. That's a collaboration between labor and environmentalists, which I think is an essential collaboration if we're going to address issues around climate change. They're really advocating for wind energy. But the city itself does not seem to me to be taking a lead in communicating about climate change and its possible long-term impacts on residents. Maybe I just don't know about those conversations, but I'm pretty tapped in and I don't hear them. The centennial of Long Beach is this year, and there's a lot of talk about that. Property values are up, and there's a lot of talk about that. And I wonder sometimes if we don't want to mess with conversations about climate change, it's because we don't want people to be afraid to buy houses. The superblock, we've got massive towers going up right on the boardwalk. Instead of keeping that land open, we're developing it. And I think I think people are afraid of this topic because they don't want their property values to go down. So I wonder, are we better prepared than we are last time? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear from Jack, any thoughts he has. I'm not so sure that we are. I think most people would probably evacuate this time. And I think that the community organizations that existed last time still exist and are still strong. The Long Beach Latino Association, Long Beach Christmas Angel, the Catholic Church, the temples that really hit the ground running after the storm, and that's the key to storm recovery in my experience. And if we have another devastating storm, I hope we have leadership as good as the one we had last time. But I'm not convinced. So I'm just gonna leave it in that uneasy place.
Thank you, Marianne. Adam.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at Hofstra. So I have a before and after Sandy trajectory too. It changed my life too in different ways. I was not in personal danger. I live in Manhattan. I was there, but we live up on a hill, and I knew that my home wasn't going to flood. We were lucky to be far enough north that the power didn't go out for us as it did for about half of Manhattan Island. But I was, as a scientist who studies hurricanes in New York City, I was suddenly in the media a lot, which I'd never done before. And I ended up teaching a class about Sandy and giving a lot of public talks, including here. Thanks, Professors Farmer and Bernhardt, for inviting me a few times, at least a couple times before now. And it sort of broadened my sense of what my role was as an academic and a citizen. I just, from being a scientist with my head down doing my papers, I suddenly thought, what is my responsibility here? And so I ended up writing this book, which is you can get if you want, and it's about half of it is about Sandy and what happened and the storm and all that. There's a lot of stuff about the forecast and then about climate change. What did it have to do with climate change? It's actually a pretty complicated story, but the short version that's relevant here is our risk is going up. Sandy was a pretty rare event, but sea level's rising and the storms are getting stronger, and so that risk is increasing. But about half the book I tried to think a bit outside my own training, because I've been talking to a lot of people and reading a lot of stuff and about what it meant. And the theme I came away with by some amount of history and comparing what had happened in New York to what's happened elsewhere when there have been disasters like this, is that, so what happened in Sandy was the risk of an event like this was known well for at least 20 years before it happened. I mean, probably longer than that, but you can find well-known government document, reports commissioned done by a bunch of federal agencies, including the Weather Service, Army Corps, and others, 20 years before, saying this could happen, pretty much exactly what happened, and these are the places that would flood, and this is what the problems would be, and these are the things that should be done. And some of those things happened, and some of those things didn't happen. And the things that did happen were better protocols for communicating the forecast, warning, getting people out of the transit system. So the subway system was shut down, 24 hours before, first in Irene the year before, when it turned out wasn't that bad for the city, but then in Sandy, and that saved a huge number of lives. The number of deaths would have been much, much higher had all that not happened in response to the science that was done in advance of Sandy. So, I mean, not that it was perfect. Some things were, didn't go right for sure, but I would say that was a success. What wasn't a success was those same studies, and there was a whole bunch of them. Some of them came out of Columbia University after that first one. This is the first one I know was in 1995. That also said, our infrastructure isn't ready for this. Stuff should be elevated. The transit system should be flood-proofed. Bridges, tunnels, subway, homes, all that stuff. And that stuff did not happen. That would have taken real investment of money. And the history shows that nobody wants to do that when the thing itself hasn't happened. So you could look at the Netherlands, where it's a model for flood, resilience work, and all the big stuff happened after one really bad flood in 1953, not before that. So, in other words, the science can be there, people can even believe it, but if it costs money and it's not clear that the thing's going to happen on any given person or institution's watch, they're generally not going to make the investment. So that was what my take on it was. And so to fast forward 10 years now, the charge here was to think about what's changed since then. And I want to talk about a couple different things. So but my general theme is that there's things happening, a lot of big things happening, and some of them are really good and some of them are really bad. And I don't know how to add it up. in the city, so we heard about what's happening in Long Beach, and I think that in New York City, which I know a little bit more about, I'm married to my wife works for the city and is involved in some of this work, so I learned about it from her. I'm by no means an expert in the post-Sandy resilience work, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot of projects. I think something like $20 billion of mostly federal money is being spent on a wide range of projects in New York City. There's no one big thing. The Army Corps is thinking about a couple of fairly substantial storm barriers, and there's the big U that's being planned around Lower Manhattan, which is a kind of big complex of seawalls and parks and stuff. And there's a lot of smaller projects, beach nourishment, dunes, seawalls here and there, tide gates, lifting stuff up, community, various things. I don't know how to, it's sort of happening slow. It's, this is bureaucratic government stuff. There's a lot of different projects. It's political, but it is happening, and I think the city is getting better prepared for events like Sandy. Certainly smaller events are easier to prepare for, and if it happened again, I think we would be a little bit better off. I don't know if we'd be a lot better off, but a little bit better off, and things are at least moving in the right direction, and it's a conscientious action by a lot of people in city, state, and federal government. At the same time, we heard about the people being, building in flood zones, and property values going up. The same thing is happening in New York City. There's been a few buyouts in really hard-hit areas where people have actually not living there anymore, but that's the minority. Most of the Sandy flood zones are getting redeveloped, high property values. It's kind of perplexing for anybody who really remembers what happened, but that's the way it is. A lot of experts that I know think that in the long term, and I'm pretty much don't see how they can be wrong, in the long term there's going to have to be more what we call managed retreat from flood zones due to sea level rise in New York City and elsewhere. I don't think we're really prepared for that yet on the scale it's going to have to happen. So that's like my somewhat complicated attempt to characterize things locally. I want to talk about national politics and climate here for a moment. Because I don't think we can talk about the last 10 years and what's changed without talking about national politics. And here are some really great things and some really bad things. So first of all, the really good things. So climate is now a factor in US politics in a way that has never been before. Not in my lifetime, not ever. So, and the evidence of this is that Congress just passed and President Biden just signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a climate bill, the first real climate bill to pass into law in the United States ever. Something like a little less than $400 billion is going into clean energy technologies, putting them into practice, developing them, into climate justice, into a lot of really, really good things. The modeling says this will reduce US emissions, carbon emissions by 40% relative to 2005 baseline by 2030. President Biden promised 50% under the Paris Agreement, so this gets that's 3/4 or something of the way there. It by no means solves the whole climate problem. We need to do a lot more, but it gives us credibility in international negotiations. The emissions reductions themselves are real. The technologies will keep getting cheaper because of these investments and more widely deployed. It is a really, really big deal, and I think it's a credit to the activists, including especially the youth climate movement, that deserves a lot of credit for this, as well as their older allies. And it wasn't clear until the last moment that it was going to happen. It looked like it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. Joe Manchin wasn't going to vote for it, and then he did somehow. Who knows who got to him? But it's really amazing. At the same time, we have a two-party system in this country, as you know, and one of the two parties is not just totally opposed to any climate action. No Republican voted for the IRA, but even in some ways to the bedrock principles of our democracy now. So this sounds like partisan politics that I'm bringing into here, but I don't know how not to do it. I don't know how to talk about what's happened in the last 10 years since Sandy without talking about this. So following former President Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election, the New York Times reported this Sunday that 6 Republican nominees for governor and the Senate in key midterm states would not commit to accepting the outcome of the November election, the midterms happening in 2 months, and 5 others wouldn't answer the question. This just terrifies me. I started off by saying that, talking about the book I wrote about Sandy and saying that one of the themes was that we don't tend not to prepare for things we haven't experienced. I think that's the lesson from Sandy, especially if it costs us something to do so. And we can't quite visualize something bad if we've never experienced until it happens. That's why people don't evacuate. Right? If they see a forecast of a storm and they've never seen a storm like that before, they sort of don't believe it. I think we're facing something similar here. I don't think there's been anything like this in US history before, where we have one of two parties that doesn't accept the principle that you have to accept the outcome of an election. And I don't think we can imagine what the outcomes of that will be if in fact that faction is able to carry out that threat. I think there's no other thing to call it. And it's, to bring it back to climate, among other reasons this worries me, it certainly wouldn't be a good thing for the climate if we go that way. So it's dizzying. But to end on a positive note, one more thing. On the other hand, the private sector is all in on climate now. Well, all in would be too strong, but there's tremendous motion on the private sector in climate. I'm most aware of the insurance and financial industries because we work with them on characterizing hurricane risk, but many, many areas of the private sector, companies are getting serious about climate in the way they weren't before. There's definitely a lot of greenwashing, and some of it is not, serious, but some of it is, and it's creating jobs, real good jobs for our students, for you, if you know something about climate in addition to all the other skills you're learning here. So, that's another one of the positive things. And I don't think anything that happens in government can completely change that, although, I think that momentum is there for the foreseeable future. Although obviously what government does matters too. So it's dizzying. Most people who know me would call me a pessimistic person, and both our current politics and global warming in the long term really do scare me in some respects. But at the same time, some great things are happening too that were hard to imagine 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. So there's big challenges, but we have to believe, I think we all have to believe, that we can make a difference through our work, through activism, through whatever means we have. So, I'm happy to be here speaking to you, and thank you for having me. I hope we can talk about that more in the next few minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to all three panelists for their insights and experiences. Really fascinating and powerful. So just start off broad here, and since we have so many students in the audience, and Adam, you touched on this a bit, but what are some things that younger students can do to help make us more resilient and be active and everything? And I think all three of you have different perspectives that can help answer that question.
I can go first here. For us, where we try to kind of get students involved is really in terms of sometimes the citizen science. I think we try and do a lot of outreach education with students from college to high school and elementary school, and at least kind of exposed to the earth sciences, natural sciences, the weather, and kind of pique that interest. I think that's kind of where we start, and I think for those who do have that interest in there, we have different programs, really, starting with citizen science, being able to, communicate with the Weather Service. We'll give weather observing classes. What we have is something called a Skywarn Weather Observer program. If you have that interest, what we provide is classes to train on weather spotting, seeing different storm features, cloud features, staying alert to different, weather alerts, and then really kind of looking from you, what are you observing on the ground? Because I think one of the most important things for us is the observations. What are you seeing? Because we can see things through the models, the radar, satellite. We have observation stations. But in terms of real world, what's happening in terms of potentially road flooding, down trees, how much snow has fallen, kind of wind reports, things like that. So I think that's one way to kind of get involved. And the more accurate information we can get. It not only helps us in terms of situational awareness, but even to put out warnings that are going to save lives and property, to know that, all right, this storm is producing this type of impacts. We of course we want you to do it in a safe manner, but that's definitely an opportunity there for those who are interested in it. Just on the storm surge side, we do, and even rip currents, kind of getting reports from anybody, from the public, but I think students would be great. Just what are the impacts you're seeing from perhaps a high tide event, like a spring tide event, a coastal storm, swells now we're seeing from kind of distant, from Fiona. We're going to be seeing some large swells affecting our beaches. So again, to stay safe, but what are the impacts? I think that's a great way to kind of get involved and help out your local weather services to put out the information and the kind of the most informed warnings, timely warnings, is through that observation. So that's just one thing, in this aspect.
So I'll chime in. So I don't know if Krista's here, but Krista Farmer and I one time went to, I think it was Todd Kaminsky's office. Do you remember we went with the Sunrise Movement, the two of us? And we were by far the oldest people there. I think there might have been one person who was a little bit older, or maybe our age. And it was really heartwarming to see all these young people. And so I think the suggestions are great. My suggestion would be become politically active. Become scientifically and climatologically literate, if that makes sense, but also become politically active and be merciless. Do not let them off the hook. If you are promised something by an elected official who's seeking re-election or by someone who's seeking election in the first place, and you give them your vote and they don't deliver, hold them accountable. Don't take their excuses, right? This is like 0 hour. And you, for better or worse, are going, the buck is being passed to you. Whether that's a good thing or not, we can debate, but that is more or less the truth. So be merciless political activists. Extract promises, and if the candidates don't deliver on the promises, then hold them accountable and look for candidates who will. That would be what I would suggest.
All the above. I mean, I think, as I was trying to say, I think there's more and more opportunities on the climate issue and to engage in it through work. In other words, because many industries, as well as government, across all the area, many professions and areas of work, the interest in climate is at a level it's never been. And so one piece of advice that I heard from someone, I don't remember who I'm quoting, was, if you want to do something about climate, do some work that you feel strongly about and find a way to make climate part of it. And I think there are a lot of ways to do that now. As I said, I know the most about the financial sector, but I have a friend who works in an architecture firm. Anything having to do with buildings, big energy issue there, and a lot of chances to make things greener. And I think there's many other examples like that. But absolutely about the activism. I mean, I think the thing that really made the difference in U.S. politics on climate over the last really just few years is the youth climate movement. And I think the recognition there that was so powerful was that this is a social justice issue. It's not a special issue for science nerds or environmentalists wearing Birkenstocks. It is a social justice issue and a generational justice issue. And so, the more you can act on that, I don't need to amplify what my colleague just said was perfect, but I couldn't endorse it more.
Thank you all. Another question. So Nelson mentioned the storm in his remarks at the beginning. So today is actually the 84th anniversary of the 1938 Long Island Express hurricane, which was far worse than Sandy. Fortunately, far fewer people lived here at that point, and also hit sparsely populated Suffolk County. But imagining if that hurricane now tracked a little further west, or if Hurricane Fiona, which just struck Puerto Rico and the islands and is now headed toward Nova Scotia, if that tracked a few hundred miles west, we'd be talking devastation, far beyond Sandy across the tri-state area. So we have a captive audience right now. So the three panelists, what would you say to try to encourage action and raise awareness, because we are generally underprepared? I think we'd all agree. So what would you say to convey that the emotion behind this of we're so unprepared for this potentially catastrophic situation that could happen at any point.
Yeah, Jase. So I mean, that's really been a huge part of the outreach education we've been doing really over the last several years. Is sometimes it's good to look back at history. I mean, and I think this is what we're doing here today. But we've really tried to focus on that 1938 storm as what potentially could happen here. Sandy was bad in terms of storm surge. Ida was, again. We dealt with 27 fatalities, loss of life from extreme rainfall. But we haven't had a landfalling hurricane here since 1985, Category 1 Gloria. You have to go back to 1954, Hurricane Carol, which made landfall as a major hurricane all the way on the East End. We've had some smaller ones. The thing is, people remember Gloria, and you guys won't remember Gloria, but I remember Gloria. I was 10 years old at the time, knocked down pretty much half the trees on our block. And that was it was just a borderline Category 1 hurricane. Sustained winds, I think the peak sustained winds were in the lower 80s, but made landfall in central Long Island. So generally we were looking at gusts maybe in the 80, 90 mile per hour range. But we were without power for 2 weeks, and schools were shut down. For us for a week. I think Long Island had lost. I think it was 3/4 of the customers were without power at one point. Tremendous amount of damage. You look at, but again, and it's something where you look at something, and the winds probably were not too far off from what we saw with Sandy. Sandy, we had gusts 80 to 90 miles per hour. And Sandy, we actually had quite a, like I said, 24 fatalities due to just the winds. And so you take a storm that's, like a 1938 hurricane, a Category 3 hurricane that, that was actually making a little bit of a, Sandy was unique in terms of that sharp left turn westward track. But, the 1938 hurricane, it was taking a northwestward track. A lot of you look at climatology, a lot of tropical systems, they're kind of mimicking the coast, paralleling the coast. And so we're not necessarily in the most intense part of the storm. But what we're kind of really worried is this Sandy type of storms. There was an 1893 hurricane that made landfall right in New York City. But, a Category 3 kind of taking a little more of that westward track. That would be devastating. In terms of, when you look at the damage potential, it's exponential as you go from, if you double the wind speed, you're not doubling the wind power. It's 30 times, the power in terms of, the damage potential. I know a study done by, Connecticut DEMIS looking at, Connecticut State Emergency Management, just looking at comparing, they actually compared Isaias, which we had 2 years ago, which was another one that, it was a mid-grade tropical storm, but we had power outages 1 to 2 weeks. We saw a lot of tree damage, a lot of utility impacts, but you're talking about something double that. We could be looking at 50 to 75% of the trees down. You think about the infrastructure that would impact with a lot more building. I think Adam was talking about just the amount of building that has gone on even post Sandy and the amount of population we have near our coastlines. Just the impacts. If remembering from Sandy, just the long lines for gasoline. So just typical conveniences or things that we take for granted. I think that's the scary part about it. We could be without electricity, and instead of talking about weeks, there could be areas months without electricity when you're talking about a Category 3 hurricane. And then the storm surge impacts, as bad as it was with Sandy, it could be double that, and especially in this New York Bight area, New York Harbor area, western Long Island Sound, western Great South Bay, up the riverine areas. There's just a lot of vulnerability. I think, as I was mentioning before, we have the capabilities now to predict and really communicate what the impacts are going to be, visualize what the impacts are going to be, but the impacts are going to occur. Hopefully we can, through all the preparedness with emergency management, public safety, we can make the right decision in terms of evacuations. But I'm very concerned about is the recovery after that. This could be months, years. We still, still people, residents after Sandy who still haven't, haven't recovered. And you talk something like a Category 3 hurricane. It's not when, it's if. That's a really scary part for us, and why we're doing so much outreach with public safety officials, with the public, and as well as the whole community. Jase on the academic side, and my colleagues here. Private enterprise. So I think it's just something for right now. I think preparedness. I think going into any hurricane season, knowing what are your risks? Are you in a flood zone? Either due to storm surge or fresh water. Once you know your risks, having an evacuation plan, and this is things you want to sit down with your family. Where are you going to go? Who are you going to tell? What are you going to do with your pets? Having what's the escape route? Having a preparedness kit. I think conservatively it's 2 to 3 days: food, water, medicine, batteries. But before you can even get maybe help come to you. But that's the thing, we don't know with a Category 3 affecting today, that could be even longer. And so things and just kind of looking to ways to kind of fortify where you are. And having those plans are important. I think every year we prepare because we don't know when it's going to hit. It's important to now's the time before the season to always take action. So things to talk to your family about. I'll stop there.
You're stressing me out, guy. What he said. Prepare. September is Preparedness Month, so you should prepare. Have a kit. Here's just a comment too about losing power, which is a big deal. Losing power is not good. Let me tell you what's worse: losing the ability to flush your toilet. I would take no power for 2 months before I would take a week without toilets. You know how psychologically damaging that is? To know that, like, you're eating, and you're thinking, oh, I can't flush the toilet. So stuff's coming in. What do we do when it has to come out? It's awful. I mean, power's the least of it. And probably the best message we got in Long Beach after Sandy was when our communications director for the city flashed on a board, "You can flush," right? That made like international social media. It's really psychologically difficult to be without power, but also to be without all of the other things that make like a sanitary life. So to kind of not have to really feel the brute force of that, what I would recommend is know if you're in a flood zone and evacuate if you get the message. Leave. You have nothing to prove. Go. And if you don't have to go, my suggestion is contact people who you know who do have to go and offer them shelter. Like, be one of the people who does a good thing. Go or offer shelter to others who have to go, or offer to shelter their pets. I talked to a number of people. One woman had a pot-bellied pig, and she would not let that pig go to a shelter, so she stayed. So offer shelter, go yourself if you have to, and then thirdly, when all is said and done and the storm's over, if you are able, get in your car or get on the bus and offer to help. Rebuilding. It's really important. The city of Long Beach would not have rebuilt nearly as quickly as it did had we not had volunteers from just about everywhere you can think of, coming down, rolling up their sleeves, based on what people there need, not what you think they need. So like, we got so many, like, must have been like everyone in New York had clothes they needed to get rid of, and Sandy happened and everyone said, yeah, I could finally clean out my closet. Take your cues from the people who are affected and go and give them what they need.
First of all, when we say I feel like I should say something positive. That when we say we're not prepared, there is a way in which we're actually way better prepared than we ever were, as Nelson could attest to better than anybody. I think it's an underappreciated triumph of modern science that we have forecasts today that are amazingly good, that make it possible to know several days in advance that, most likely who's going to have to evacuate, and a couple days in advance, for sure who has to, and that those are pretty accurate. I mean, the forecast in Sandy 5 days before, even longer than that, but by 5 days before, all the weather models were agreeing on basically what was going to happen, almost exactly as it did. And that is amazing. That does not happen in 1938. 38 storm was not forecast well. The number of deaths was, I don't know, I want to say 500, 600, something like that. In Sandy, it was, I believe, under 100 in the United States. You know, that's awful to lose 100 people, but that number could be so much higher. And those better forecasts are not the result of any one scientific breakthrough. They're the result of decades of hard work by a lot of people, mostly federal government money, people building the computers, making the models better, the forecasters learning how to use it, the satellites, the weather balloons, and all that. So just to say one good thing, we know when these things are coming. We have a heads up, and that, you know, that makes a big difference. You have to listen to it, like you just heard, you know, educating people and making them understand when this is real, even though there's always uncertainties and it could be wrong. So sometimes it doesn't happen, and then people feel like they don't have to, you know, they don't have to listen next time, and we have to learn to, you know, get past that. But that's a real thing. But I think in terms of, you know, what we can do to be better prepared, besides the emergency management and response in the short term, I think a lot of it is infrastructure. I mean, you know, to talk about Puerto Rico for a second, what's happening there right now is really, I'm trying to find the right words for it. It's kind of unforgivable. I mean, such devastation 5 years ago in Hurricane Maria, and, you know, power network kind of came back, but it's just so chronically underinvested. So the whole island was without power a couple days ago. I don't know how much of it is back now. Maybe not that much. It just shouldn't be, and I'm sure there's water problems and all that too, although I haven't, you know, I can't give you the facts or the numbers, but, and what we've seen, it doesn't even take a storm. Look at what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, we underinvest in infrastructure really, really badly in this country, and you see it all the time, but you especially see it in disasters. And climate adaptation and resilience, a lot of that is just doing stuff we should do anyway to make the infrastructure function, and it's not something we're great at in this, you know, in the United States, even though we're rich and, you know, have the resources to do it as a country. So, yeah, that's my political statement.
Thank you all for those powerful words. I have about 15 to 20 minutes left, so I'd like to invite the audience, if there's any questions, please do use the microphones in the two aisles if you do have a question or comment or anything for our three panelists based on their really insightful discussions and comments.
Hi, so you brought up the Puerto Rico thing. I had
Can you talk into the mic so everyone can
Oh,
hear?
hi, sorry. So I had a few comments to make about Puerto Rico that I've been thinking about bringing up this whole time. So I was wondering why we've been focusing so much on Sandy this whole time. I know it's like a local issue, but like I know like 5 years ago in Hurricane Maria, almost 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico alone. And I mean, with Fiona, they haven't gotten power back yet. They haven't gotten water back yet. Their infrastructure never came back from 5 years ago, and they're part of the U.S. Like they're not a state. They aren't represented, and we never help them the way that we should. And that's just chronically shown when they're hit so constantly by natural disasters and we do nothing for them. And I just feel like we should really be at least talking about them a lot more and trying to do something for them a lot more than we are. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah.
You know, it's political will. Like I mean, I think the decision to focus on Sandy is that it's a 10-year anniversary and it happened here. We could focus on wildfires. We could focus on, you know, flooding all over the place. I mean, there's lots of climate-related disasters that we could focus on. We could focus on the double whammy to Puerto Rico. The truth is, like, this is not going to stop happening, and we need to help in Puerto Rico. We need to help everywhere, right? You know, how heartbreaking. I remember after Sandy when they were debating whether, you know, the Sandy aid bill, to go on social media and read articles about it and then read the comments and have people say, screw them, I hate New York, I hope they all die. It's like, I mean, it's not like we got a lot more aid, point well taken, But there's still resistance even to that. I mean, you have people now who don't want to vote for climate change, for, weather disaster rebuilding funding or, or whatever the initial word is for the aftermath. And I agree with you, that's awful. And I don't know what to do about that. I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned here is all the stuff we're talking about costs money. And we have a really regressive tax system in the US, and there are lots of people who should be paying more to fund some of this stuff, and they're not. So even the communities that are getting help grudgingly. I mean, even, somebody brought up the idea of managed retreat. I think it was you. Like, I've had people say to me, why don't you just move? And I say to people, like, do you not understand that if every person who lives in Puerto Rico and Long Beach and New Jersey and California decides to move, where are we all going to go? Like, we have a completely dysfunctional government in a lot of ways. I don't think right now, and I'm an optimist, but I don't think we actually even could handle the kinds of things that we need to be even thinking about right now to get people to where they're safer. So yes, and at every level. And, we got to be willing to commit the money. We got to be willing to change the way we think about things from individual, atomized decisions into a collective effort to keep people safe. And we're just not there right now. And that's, I think, tragic.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Hey, how you doing? So, my question was about the flood going back. I'm sure you guys are aware of the year ago, the flood that hit the city, mostly most areas of the boroughs, and living through that, seeing the aftermath. I remember hearing stories during the floods of a bunch of traffic from the city, a lot of cars breaking down, especially on the highways. And going back to the aftermath, I remember driving down one of the highways, seeing a bunch of cars pulled over on the side of the highways. So I was wondering, essentially, what's the best course of action to take if, I don't know, something like that would ever happen to me? Because I'm in the middle of a flood and I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know this is something, we've gotten a lot, as Adam was talking about, in terms of the advances in technology, in terms of the science, the research, and so we're in a lot better place in terms of storm surge flooding, being able to forecast it and communicate it. Flash flooding, which is what with Ida, it was not due to the storm surge, but it was due to extreme rainfall. I think we're at that point like we were a year after Sandy. There's a lot of collaborations being done, looking at how can we improve things in terms of extreme rainfall forecasting. I think the big thing is the visualization of impacts. That's I think going to be very helpful. If we can take the forecast we had, we're looking at potentially 3 to 6 inches of rain, locally 8 inches of rain. But have that better forecast information, which is going to come with improved modeling. We're going to have this, this potential for this type of rainfall rates, and then be able to visualize, okay, what are the impacts? So there could be preventative measures taken in advance. So one of the things we're working with New York City Emergency Management. They're working on a new flash flood plan. So looking at just what the potential flash flood threat is it like a moderate or high flash flood threat? So they preemptively could close roads. So that's one thing that I think in the future could help is that improvement in science, that improvement in communication, just like with storm surge, maybe evacuations ahead of time, is to be able to close roads. Doing a basement flooding that occurred in New York City that we really hadn't seen that at that level, that severity. To be able to visualize that, model that, I think that's coming, but it's going to take some time. Now, if you're ever stuck in a situation, first thing I think is to be weather aware. It's kind of what we try to do, as Weather Service is provide information. And so something like Ida, we were providing information a few days in advance of the potential for significant flooding. Then, issuance of a flood watch. So when you see something like that, it's being aware and paying attention to the forecast. So basically, you're going to be paying attention to there is a threat of life-threatening flooding. So I want to pay attention. The alerts should come over the radio, now it's through your cell phones where you can get these wireless emergency alerts. When I start to hear that and you get that alert, the most important thing is getting to higher ground. I know in a lot of, when you're outside of the city, maybe that's an easier thing. When you're stuck on, say, the BQE in New York City, and you're raining at 3 inches per hour, you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. That's not so easy, and that's a difficult question. I think if you can, the best thing is to see before you even as soon as you get the alerts, to get somewhere that is kind of a higher ground, maybe kind of getting off of the highway system to somewhere that is elevated, maybe into a building up to higher floors, something like that. If you're in the car, is there somewhere that's within walking distance that's not flooded, that you're walking through flooded roadways, that you try to get to a higher elevation? It's a unique problem, in New York City, just because of the traffic, the congestion, and when something like that happens, you're just basically trapped. We've seen it where people just get on top of their cars and things like that, unfortunately. But I think it's it's the preemptiveness, that I think is coming down the line that could help with that. But in this situation, it's always kind of getting to higher ground, don't go, turn around, don't drown. We say that, but in New York City, it's basically, don't drown. It's like you can't turn around on the highway. You can't. So it's trying to. And unfortunately, with some of these situations, where we actually for that event we actually issued flash flood emergencies for the first time, where what we were seeing on radar, satellite, and then the reports that were coming in were so severe that this was something when you issued that flash flood emergency, you're getting those alerts on your phone. This is a situation where first responders can't even get to you. You really have to take it into your own actions to get higher. If there's other trucks or something like that, maybe just kind of trying to get whatever you can do to get to a higher with some safety. Unfortunately, not a perfect answer, and sometimes these situations there is no perfect choice, but there's maybe a better choice.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Yeah, Brett.
I have kind of a short story and a question related to media coverage, particularly before the event. So Hurricane Irene preceded Hurricane Sandy by a year. This is pre-Jase at Hofstra. We didn't have Jase around, so it fell to me to be sort of the university expert, in massive air quotes, on hurricanes. And the week before Irene hit, I did nothing but do radio interviews for radio stations all across the country about, what were the anticipated impacts of Irene. I mean, the fact that I was living, in the danger zone on Long Island made it particularly interesting. I was interviewed on News 4 New York Live. They sent a limo for me and brought me to, 30 Rock and all that. Tremendous amount of media interest. And then Irene came, and there was none of the flooding that I told everybody, that was, the big danger. And then the following year, when Sandy was coming, crickets. No media interest, as far as I could tell, really. Just a completely, order of magnitude less, at least. And I can't help but feel that if Irene hadn't happened and all that interest had existed for Sandy, that a lot more people would have evacuated. And a friend of my, an old friend of my wife, who lived in Island Park, came to, evacuated and came to our house for, the night of Irene and stayed with us. And he decided not to evacuate for Sandy. And of course, his house was completely flooded out and destroyed. And he parked his truck on what he thought was high ground, and it wasn't. So, you know, I wonder if you want to comment on sort of the role that the media plays. And I do want to put in a plug. We do have a session tomorrow afternoon, I think at 4:30 in the Cultural Center Theater, where we're going to be discussing the role of local media in covering climate change issues. But if you care to comment, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I could make a quick comment. You know, the media, they're a great partner of ours. I mean, they are, you know, a huge amplifier of our messaging. So, you know, we put out watches, warnings, advisories. We do, you know, we'll have kind of maybe integrated workshops. We'll have, you know, trainings that we will include them in. So they're very, you know, especially for tropical, they're aware of our products and services. We are, you know, we do briefings, kind of decision support service briefings ahead of, you know, hazardous weather events. And we provide them. They're one of our core partners that we provide because we want that, it's the consistency of messaging, the messaging that coming from multiple different sources, that's important, and that kind of prompts action. You know, I can say, you bring up a great point, and this wasn't, you know, just in terms of media. This was, you know, the challenge we had with, you know, it's just even, it's human nature, just the challenge with the public, with the public safety officials. You see that, you know, we put a lot of effort into Irene and in terms of looking at, you know, what would the impacts going to be in terms of wind, storm surge, and, you know, it's not a deterministic answer. It's not a yes/no answer. It's a probabilistic, you know, problem that needs probabilistic answers. And that's, I think, part of that is a lot of the education outreach we're doing. You know, none of these forecasts, we can't, because of the, you know, the risk is so high with something like storm surge, where we have such a, you know, the probability may be low that we see this, you know, with any type of storm, depending on it's the size, its track, the speed. Just little wobbles are going to have huge differences in terms of the storm surge impacts. But we can't predict that 3 days in advance, 2 days in advance, sometimes even a day in advance. You look at the National Hurricane Center, their track forecast error, it's 40 miles, even 1 day out. And so 40 miles, you're talking about landfall, say, in western Suffolk County versus New York City. That's a huge difference in terms of deadly storm surge, say, with a hurricane. So what we have to provide is reasonable worst-case scenarios. And a reasonable worst-case scenario is if it's calibrated right, and this is what we try to educate on. If it's calibrated right, 9 out of 10 times, you know, we're trying to look at the 90%, you know, probability. Only a 10% probability is going to be exceeded because it's a low probability event. But when you take a low probability event that has high consequence and in a high vulnerability area, that makes for a high risk. So we really have to prepare for these high risk situations where life is a threat. We have to with a lot of margin for safety, with kind of thinking in that way. But the way it's set up, these low probability events, they're only going to, you know, if it's calibrated right, these 10% exceedance that we try to look at, they're only going to happen 1 out of 10 times. So 9 out of 10 times, you may be predicting that this is a possibility. We need to prepare for this, but 9 out of 10 times it's not going to happen. And so that's a difficult, you know, kind of risk, you know, kind of cost-loss analysis for anybody to do, because there's different levels of decisions that have to be made from public to partners. I think this is something that our partners have, you know, it was, all right, with Irene, it was hard to get that across, and there were decisions that were made because they were seeing, all right, there's only a 10% chance water gets this high, and there was a lot of just lost to some infrastructure, where mobile infrastructure that could have been moved because decisions weren't made. But then Sandy, on the other hand, that was that 10% exceedance. That was that 1 in 10 times. But we've had events since then, several tropical, as much as recent as Henri in 2021, I guess, was it last year? Yeah. Where, you know, this looked like, all right, we're looking at a low-end hurricane potential for 3 to 5 feet of inundation. If you're looking at the reasonable worst-case scenario, it didn't occur. I think we didn't see as much kind of blowback. I don't want to say blowback, but what happened as we did after Irene. But the thing is, the other thing with Irene, it's all kind of where you're located, location, location, location. New York City got lucky. That peak surge came in during a lower tide. But you ask Connecticut residents, they remember that. Coastal Connecticut, they got battered. And luckily, I don't remember, no loss of life from storm surge, but a lot of damage along the coast. And so, yeah, we don't have, in terms of, in terms of how the media will kind of, depending where the center of the impact is, I'm sure that's going to play into it in terms of how strong the media coverage is. But I think these are all things that, in terms of what are the lessons learned, what have we tried to do since Sandy, is really kind of push each one of these storms is unique. The way we have to prepare for them is based on that reasonable worst case scenario, because the loss of life is such a high, that's something we can't, we don't want to tolerate if we have the potential to prevent it. And so there are going to be a lot of false alarms, and we have to be, able to deal with that. But, I think the more visualizations, the education, things like that, we can kind of help to, and the stuff that Jase's doing, we can have a better conception of, all right, if we don't prepare, this is what may happen. And the complicating factor is here. We have so many, we have tides and all these things. You look at Hurricane Gloria. That came in during low tide. There was a 6-7 foot surge, but it came in directly at low tide, and it was moving so fast that we had minimal impacts. But that was another one where people were like, hurricane, not a big deal. But you look at that, you go back to 1938, 1954. You had totally different stories. So that's the challenge for us, was the perspective. But we try to work with our media partners, and definitely our public safety partners, in terms of kind of making that, making that connection and making sure they're preparing when they can.
Can I just jump in for one? Everything he said, but I think most people don't interpret weather reports that way. They don't measure the kind of technical things one against the other. If I had a nickel for every person I interviewed who said, I left for Irene and nothing happened, I could buy you coffee every day for 2 weeks. Right? And I teach persuasion, and one of the things I teach students is no message is ever interpreted in a vacuum. If I want you to buy a $150 sweater, what am I going to do? I'm going to show you a $250 sweater first, because if I just show you the $150 sweater, you're going to say, too expensive. But if I show you the $250 sweater, principle of contrast says, you will find the $150 sweater a deal, right? So I think actually, with all due respect to the technical issues around weather reporting, I think we have to create a culture of, when you get the mandatory evacuation notice, leave. That's the cool thing to do. Because people aren't going to process a lot of the other stuff, and they need to not feel like I left for no good reason. If you left and you didn't get, your house was still intact when you got back, woo-hoo! Party on, and do it again next year.
Thank you. Any quick comments, Adam?
Yeah, just one. I can be really quick. I know everybody's got to go. I think this to say in different words what Nelson said. If you're doing the science is inherently uncertain. So if we say, so if you're doing the forecasts and warnings right, you will say something. You will tell people they have to worry about something, and then a lot of times it won't happen. So the fact that it doesn't happen doesn't mean the forecast was wrong. It means you did it right. And people have to understand that it's a risk problem. We can never give the perfect forecast, but we have to prepare for the worst case scenarios. The same is true with the climate problem. We don't know exactly in every place, in every way, how bad climate change is going to be, how soon. But we have to take all those worst case scenarios seriously, and that's just the way it is. So, when you see some really, really scary stuff in the newspaper, is it really going to happen in our lifetime? Some of it almost certainly yes, some of it almost certainly no, some of it we don't know. But it's just like the warning of a hurricane. You got to do the right thing. You got to get out of the way of it.
Well put. And on that note, let's thank our panel for their amazing insights.